Hey there! Welcome back to the channel where we explore history's most brutal realities in the most relaxing way possible. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make your cozy bed feel like absolute luxury. We're talking about Viking life, and trust me, after hearing what these Norse warriors endured daily, you'll never complain about your morning commute again. Now, before we begin this journey back to medieval Scandinavia, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, maybe grab a warm drink. Because where we're going, comfort was a foreign concept, and survival was never guaranteed. So picture this. You've just woken up in a Viking settlement somewhere along the fjords of Norway in the year 950. The first thing that hits you isn't the smell of breakfast cooking or birds chirping outside your window. It's the bone-deep cold that seeps through the wooden walls of your longhouse. Your breath forms clouds in the dim morning light, filtering through smoke holes in the roof. The fire that kept your family alive through the night has burned down to glowing embers, and someone needs to get it roaring again before everyone freezes. You're lying on a raised platform along the wall, what Vikings called a bench bed, covered in rough wool blankets and whatever furs your family managed to acquire. The mattress beneath you isn't memory foam, or even straw like medieval peasants used. It's seaweed. Dried, scratchy seaweed that crackles every time you move and smells perpetually of low tide and decomposition. But here's the thing that would shock you most about Viking life. It wasn't the dramatic raids and epic battles that Hollywood loves to show us. Those were actually the exception, not the rule. The real challenge of being a Viking wasn't dying gloriously in combat. It was the grinding daily struggle to simply not die from cold, hunger, disease, or any of the 1,000 other ways the medieval world could kill you before lunch. Let me paint you a picture of what your typical day would actually look like as a Viking in the 10th century Scandinavia. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll have a whole new appreciation for central heating and grocery stores. Your Viking longhouse isn't the cozy log cabin you might imagine. It's a rectangular wooden building, maybe 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, shared with your entire extended family. We're talking parents, grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and probably a few unrelated hangers-on who've attached themselves to your household for protection. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space is a luxury no one can afford. The walls are made of vertical wooden planks with gaps between them that let in drafts no matter how much moss and mud you stuff into the cracks. The roof is covered in turf, which sounds environmentally friendly, until you realize it means you're essentially living under a leaky dirt ceiling that drips constantly when it rains, which in Norway is basically always. Down the center of the longhouse runs a stone-lined hearth, the only source of heat and light for the entire building. Smoke from this fire is supposed to escape through holes in the roof, but mostly it just fills the interior with a choking haze that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. Everyone's clothes, hair, and skin is permanently infused with wood smoke. It's not a pleasant campfire scent either. It's acrid and harsh, mixed with the smell of burning animal fat used for lighting and whatever food scraps got tossed into the flames. The floor around the hearth is packed earth, worn smooth by countless feet, but still fundamentally dirt. When it rains, which again is constantly, water seeps through the turf roof and turns sections of your floor into mud. In winter, the mud freezes solid, creating an uneven, treacherous surface that's somehow both slippery and jagged. Along the walls, raised wooden platforms serve as benches during the day and beds at night. Your entire family sleeps in this one room, separated only by hanging woolen curtains if you're lucky enough to afford them. The sound of snoring, coughing, and other bodily functions creates a constant nighttime symphony. Sleep is light and frequently interrupted because someone always needs to tend the fire, and if it goes out completely during a winter night, people can literally freeze to death in their beds. But let's talk about what you'd be wearing, because Viking fashion was all about survival, not style. Your basic outfit consists of a long linen undertunic, covered by a wool tunic that reaches to your knees. Over that, you'd wear wool leg wrappings, basically long strips of cloth wound around your legs from ankle to knee, held in place with leather cords. Your feet go into leather shoes that offer minimal protection against cold or moisture. In winter, you'd add more layers. A wool cloak fastened with a brooch, possibly lined with fur if your family could afford it or had been lucky in their hunting. Mittens made from wool or leather, though you'd have to take them off constantly for any task requiring dexterity. A wool cap that covers your ears and ties under your chin. None of these clothes fit properly in the modern sense. Everything is loose and baggy because tailoring to specific body measurements wasn't really a thing. The wool is scratchy and uncomfortable against your skin, but it's also your lifeline. Wool retains its insulating properties even when wet, which is crucial in the damp Scandinavian climate. Cotton would kill you in this environment. Here's something that might surprise you about Viking hygiene. They were actually cleaner than most medieval Europeans. Vikings bathed weekly, usually on Saturdays, which they called washing day. They had combs, tweezers, and even soap made from animal fat and ash. But don't get too excited about their cleanliness standards. Your weekly bath involves heating water over the fire in large iron cauldrons, then washing with harsh lye soap that strips your skin raw. The bathwater gets reused by multiple family members, so by the time it's your turn, you might be bathing in what's essentially dirty soup. And this luxury only happens when fuel is plentiful enough to heat that much water, which during harsh winters might mean no bathing for weeks at a time. Your hair gets washed less frequently and combed daily with bone or antler combs that have teeth wide enough to catch lice but not remove them entirely. Everyone has lice. Everyone has fleas. These aren't signs of poor hygiene. They're just facts of medieval life. You'd spend part of each day picking parasites out of your hair, your clothes, and your bedding. Dental care consists of chewing on twigs to clean your teeth and using your knife to pick out food debris. By the time you're 30, if you live that long, you'll likely be missing several teeth from decay, wear, and the occasional fight. Bad breath is universal because no one understands the connection between oral bacteria and tooth rot. Now, let's talk about food, because this is where Viking life gets really challenging. Your diet depends entirely on what your family can produce, hunt, gather, or trade for. There are no grocery stores, no restaurants, no takeout options. If your crops fail or your livestock dies, you starve. It's that simple. The foundation of your diet is gruel, not appetizing porridge or oatmeal, but actual gruel made from whatever grains you have available. Barley, oats, or rye cooked with water into a thin, flavorless soup that fills your belly without providing much nutrition. This gruel gets served at every meal, sometimes with additions if you're lucky. Bread exists, but it's not the fluffy loaves you're thinking of. Viking bread is dense, dark, and often contains sawdust, bark, or other fillers to stretch the grain supply. It's baked into hard rounds that can last for months without spoiling, which is important when you need to store food for the long winter. You don't slice this bread, you gnaw on it or soak it in liquid to soften it enough to chew. Meat is a luxury reserved for special occasions or when preservation demands it. When animals are slaughtered, usually in late fall before winter sets in, every part gets used immediately. Fresh meat might be roasted over the fire for a feast, but most of it gets preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. The result is jerky so hard and salty it requires soaking before you can eat it. Fish provides more reliable protein, especially if you live near the coast or a river. Cod, herring, and salmon get caught during their seasonal runs, and preserved through smoking or salting. But fishing is dangerous work in small boats on rough northern seas, and plenty of Vikings drown trying to bring home dinner. Vegetables are limited to what grows in the short northern growing season. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips form the backbone of your vegetable diet. Root vegetables store well in underground pits, but by spring they're often sprouted, moldy, or rotten. Fresh vegetables only exist for a few months each year. Dairy comes from your family's cows, goats, or sheep, assuming they survive the winter. Fresh milk spoils quickly without refrigeration, so most gets turned into cheese or butter for preservation. The cheese is hard, salty, and often crawling with maggots by the time you eat it. But protein is protein, and you can't afford to be picky. Your drink options are limited to water, milk, or ale. Water comes from wells, streams, or collected rainwater, and it's often contaminated with parasites or bacteria that will make you violently ill. Milk spoils rapidly and can carry diseases from sick animals, so most Vikings drink ale daily, including children, because the brewing process makes it safer than water. This ale isn't the smooth beer you're familiar with. It's thick, chunky, and often sour from wild fermentation. It has a low alcohol content, but provides calories and nutrients that straight water doesn't offer. Getting properly drunk requires strong mead made from fermented honey, which is expensive and reserved for special celebrations. Meals happen twice a day if you're lucky: a light morning meal of gruel or leftover bread, and a larger evening meal of whatever protein and vegetables are available. Lunch isn't a concept because food is too precious to waste on a third daily meal. When food runs short in late winter and early spring, you might eat only once a day or fast entirely for days at a time. Cooking happens over the central fire using iron cauldrons, wooden bowls, and simple tools. Everything is boiled, roasted, or baked directly in the coals. Seasoning consists of salt if you can afford it, wild herbs gathered in summer, and occasionally imported spices that cost more than most families earn in a year. Food storage requires constant vigilance against rats, mice, insects, and mold. Grain gets kept in large wooden chests raised off the ground. Preserved meats hang from the rafters where animals can't reach them. Root vegetables go into underground storage pits lined with straw. Despite these precautions, you'll lose a significant portion of your food stores to spoilage every year. The constant threat of famine shapes every decision about food. You can't eat all your grain in fall because you need seeds for next year's planting. You can't slaughter all your livestock because you need breeding stock for future herds. Every meal represents a careful calculation between immediate hunger and long-term survival. And here's something that would absolutely shock your modern sensibilities. Food poisoning is just accepted as a normal part of life. Without understanding bacteria or proper food safety, Vikings regularly eat spoiled meat, moldy grain, and contaminated dairy. The resulting illness is seen as bad luck or divine punishment, not as something preventable through better food handling. This constant exposure to foodborne pathogens means your digestive system is in a perpetual state of distress. Stomach cramps, nausea, and diarrhea are weekly occurrences that you just have to work through, because there's no such thing as sick days when survival depends on daily labor. But let's move beyond food and talk about the work that consumed every waking hour of Viking life. If you're imagining yourself as a fierce warrior sailing off to raid distant lands, I hate to break it to you, but that's not what most Vikings did most of the time. The reality is far more mundane and infinitely more exhausting. Your primary occupation would likely be farming, and Viking farming was a backbreaking struggle against impossible odds. The growing season in medieval Scandinavia lasted maybe 4 months if you were lucky. The soil was rocky, acidic, and poor. The weather was unpredictable, with late frosts that could kill your crops overnight, and early snowfalls that ended the harvest season before you'd gathered enough food to survive winter. You'd wake before dawn every single day during growing season to tend your fields. Plowing involved walking behind oxen or horses if your family owned them, or pulling a crude plow yourself if you didn't. The iron plowshares were expensive and often broken, leaving you to work the soil with wooden tools that barely scratched the surface. Planting meant broadcasting seeds by hand across your fields, knowing that birds, rodents, and insects would consume a significant portion before they could sprout. There were no pesticides, no fertilizers beyond animal manure, and no backup plan if your crops failed. You planted what you had and hoped the gods would be merciful. Harvesting required the entire family working from sunrise to sunset, racing against weather that could destroy months of work in a single storm. You'd cut grain with iron sickles, bundle it by hand, and carry everything to storage areas where it would be threshed with wooden flails. Every grain was precious because there wouldn't be another harvest for an entire year. But farming was just one of many essential tasks that filled your days. If you lived near the coast, you'd also be involved in fishing, which meant spending long hours in small, unstable boats on rough northern seas. These boats leaked constantly, and you'd spend as much time bailing water as actually fishing. Drowning was such a common cause of death that most Vikings never learned to swim, figuring it would only prolong their suffering if they fell overboard. Fishing nets had to be constantly repaired, using bone needles and threads made from animal sinew. Hooks were hand-forged from iron and easily lost to large fish or snags on the rocky sea bottom. Fish traps required daily checking and frequent reconstruction as storms destroyed them. If your family kept livestock, which most did, animal care consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs all required daily feeding, watering, and protection from predators. In summer, you'd drive them to pastures and guard them from wolves and bears. In winter, they'd live inside your longhouse, adding their body heat to keep the family warm, but also their waste to the already overwhelming smell. These animals were valuable beyond measure because they provided meat, milk, leather, wool, and labor. Losing even one animal to disease, predators, or accidents could mean the difference between survival and starvation for your family. You'd risk your life defending your livestock from wolves, bears, or human raiders. Milking happened twice daily and required skill to avoid getting kicked by irritated cows. The milk had to be processed immediately into cheese or butter because it would spoil within hours in summer heat. Cheesemaking was a complex process that could fail at any stage, leaving you with nothing but sour, inedible curds. Shearing sheep provided wool for clothing and trade, but it was dangerous work. Sheep could kick, bite, and struggle violently during shearing. The iron shears were crude and often cut the animals, leading to infections that could kill valuable livestock. Beyond farming and animal husbandry, every Viking household was essentially a small factory, producing everything needed for survival. You'd spend countless hours spinning wool into thread using simple spindles, then weaving that thread into cloth on crude looms. The wool had to be cleaned, carded, and dyed, using plants gathered from the countryside. Clothing production was a year-round job that fell primarily to women, but everyone participated. Men would help with shearing sheep, preparing leather, and constructing the wooden frames for looms. Children would help card wool and wind thread. A single woolen tunic might represent months of work, which explains why Vikings owned so few clothes. Leather work required tanning hides using urine, animal brains, and oak bark, in a process that took weeks and smelled absolutely horrible. But leather was essential for shoes, belts, bags, and countless other items. A skilled leather worker could tan a hide so it would last for years, while poor work would result in leather that rotted or became stiff and useless. Metalworking was another crucial skill, though most families could only afford basic iron tools. Blacksmithing required a forge, bellows, hammer, and anvil, all expensive items that might be shared among several households. Iron was precious because it had to be smelted from bog iron ore using charcoal in a process that consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Every iron tool required constant maintenance. Knives needed daily sharpening. Axes had to be rehafted when the handles broke from heavy use. Nails were so valuable they were often removed from buildings before abandoning them. When an iron tool broke beyond repair, the metal would be saved and reforged into something else. Woodworking consumed huge amounts of time because wood was needed for everything. Buildings, tools, furniture, boats, carts, and fuel all came from trees that had to be cut down with iron axes, shaped with crude tools, and assembled using wooden pegs and iron nails when available. Building a longhouse required months of work by multiple families. Trees had to be selected, felled, stripped of bark, shaped into planks, and fitted together. The roof required layers of birch bark covered with turf that had to be cut, transported, and carefully layered to prevent leaks. Boat building was a specialized skill that few mastered, but every coastal family needed at least a small fishing boat. These vessels were constructed using overlapping planks held together with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair mixed with tar. A single boat might require an entire year to complete and could be destroyed by a single storm. Even simple furniture like benches, chests, and tables required skilled woodworking. Most families owned very few pieces because each item represented weeks of work. A wooden chest might serve as seating, storage, and a table, depending on the family's needs at any given moment. Food preservation required specialized wooden containers. Barrels for storing ale and water had to be carefully crafted to prevent leaks. Wooden bowls and spoons were carved by hand and replaced frequently as they wore out or broke. The constant need for fuel meant that gathering firewood was a year-round task. Dead trees had to be located, cut down, chopped into manageable pieces, and transported back to the settlement. Green wood had to be split and dried for months before it would burn properly. A single family needed several cords of wood to survive winter, and gathering it required enormous amounts of labor. Women spent countless hours each day preparing food, not just cooking, but processing grains, preserving meat, making cheese, brewing ale, and managing food stores. Grinding grain into flour required hand-operated querns that took hours of work to produce enough flour for daily bread. The grinding stones had to be regularly resurfaced and replaced when they wore out. Cooking over an open fire required constant attention to prevent burning while ensuring food was safe to eat. Iron pots and cauldrons were expensive and had to last for generations, so they were carefully maintained and repaired when damaged. Water collection was another daily chore that usually fell to women and children. Wells had to be dug by hand and lined with stones to prevent collapse. Water had to be carried in heavy wooden buckets or leather containers from the well to the longhouse multiple times each day. In winter, ice had to be melted for drinking water and cooking. Cleaning was a constant battle against dirt, smoke, animal waste, and human filth. Floors had to be swept daily and periodically covered with fresh straw or rushes. Bedding had to be aired and cleaned to control the inevitable infestation of fleas and lice. Laundry involved hauling clothes and linens to streams or rivers, beating them against rocks with wooden paddles, and hanging them to dry in whatever weather conditions existed. Soap was made from animal fat and wood ash in a process that was both labor-intensive and dangerous due to the caustic nature of lye. All of these tasks had to be completed while maintaining constant vigilance against the many threats that could destroy your family overnight. Raiders might attack without warning, stealing food, livestock, and people. Wild animals posed a constant threat to both humans and domesticated animals. Fires could spread rapidly through wooden buildings, destroying everything your family owned. Disease was perhaps the greatest threat of all. Without understanding of germs or infection, minor injuries often became life-threatening. A simple cut could lead to blood poisoning. A bad tooth could cause an infection that killed you. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mothers and babies, with high mortality rates that meant many women died young, and many children never reached adulthood. The isolation of Viking settlements meant that help was rarely available when disaster struck. If your crops failed, your neighbors were probably facing the same crisis. If disease struck your family, there were no doctors or medicines to help. If raiders attacked, you had only your immediate community to rely on for defense. And through all of this daily struggle for survival, Vikings still maintained complex social structures, religious beliefs, and cultural traditions that shaped every aspect of their lives. But that's a story for another part of our journey through this harsh medieval world, where every sunrise brought new challenges and survival was never guaranteed. Guaranteed. This social hierarchy wasn't just about prestige or political power. It was literally a matter of life and death, determining who ate when food was scarce, who received protection during raids, and who got the warmest spot by the fire during brutal winter nights. At the top of Viking society sat the jarls, the wealthy landowners who controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of followers. These weren't self-made men who'd worked their way up from poverty. They were born into wealth and power, inheriting not just land but entire networks of obligations and alliances that stretched across Scandinavia. If you were lucky enough to be born into a jarl family, your life would still be incredibly harsh by modern standards, but you'd have advantages that meant the difference between survival and death. You'd sleep on actual mattresses stuffed with down instead of scratchy seaweed. Your clothes would be made from finer wool, possibly even silk imported from distant lands. Your food would include imported spices, honey, and preserved fruits that ordinary Vikings never tasted. But even as a jarl, you'd face constant threats to your position. Rival families plotted to steal your lands. Your own followers might betray you if they sensed weakness. Enemy raiders specifically targeted wealthy settlements, knowing the potential for greater plunder. Political alliances shifted constantly, and yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's mortal enemy. Below the jarls came the carls, free farmers who owned their own land and formed the backbone of Viking society. This is probably where you'd find yourself if you'd been born into a typical Viking family. You weren't wealthy, but you weren't a slave either. You had rights under the law, could speak at the thing, the local assembly, and theoretically had the freedom to make your own choices about where to live and how to make your living. In practice, your freedom was severely limited by economic reality. You owned perhaps a small farm with a few animals, maybe a fishing boat if you lived near the coast. Your survival depended on maintaining good relationships with more powerful neighbors who could protect you from raiders or help during famines. You couldn't afford to offend anyone who might have influence over your fate. Your children's futures were largely determined by birth order and gender. Your eldest son would inherit your farm and position in society. Younger sons faced difficult choices. They could stay and work as laborers for their older brother, try to carve out new farmland from wilderness, or seek their fortune through trade, raiding, or military service. Daughters had even fewer options. They would be married off to forge alliances between families, often to men they'd never met. A daughter's value was measured by the dowry she could bring, and the political connections her marriage would create. Love was irrelevant. Compatibility was unimportant. Marriage was a business transaction designed to benefit both families. At the bottom of Viking society were the thralls, slaves who had no rights and could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their owner's whim. This wasn't a small population either. Historians estimate that slaves made up perhaps 20 to 30% of Viking society. These weren't people who'd fallen into debt or committed crimes. Most were captives taken during raids on other settlements. If you'd been captured and enslaved, your life would become a nightmare of backbreaking labor and constant humiliation. You'd work longer hours than free people, eat the worst food, sleep in the coldest corners of buildings, and face physical punishment for the smallest infractions. Escape was nearly impossible because runaway slaves were easily identified by their accents, unfamiliarity with local geography, and lack of family connections. Female slaves faced additional horrors. They were expected to provide sexual services to their masters and had no protection against rape or assault. Any children born from these encounters would also be slaves, creating a hereditary cycle of bondage that could last for generations. Even free Vikings lived under constant threat of enslavement. Raiders from other regions might attack your settlement and carry you off to be sold in distant slave markets. Political conflicts could result in entire families being enslaved as punishment for backing the wrong side. War captives automatically became slaves regardless of their previous social status. This ever-present fear of enslavement influenced every aspect of Viking life. Settlements were fortified against attack. Families maintained weapons even during peacetime. Children were taught to hide at the first sign of danger. The sight of unknown ships on the horizon sent entire communities into panic as they prepared for possible slave raids. The legal system that governed Viking society was equally harsh and unforgiving. There were no professional judges or lawyers. Justice was administered by local assemblies where free men gathered to hear disputes and pronounce verdicts. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Accusations were often settled through trial by combat or ordeal. If someone accused you of theft, murder, or other serious crimes, you might be forced to undergo trial by hot iron. This involved carrying a red-hot piece of metal for a certain distance. If your burns healed cleanly within a set period, usually 3 days, you were declared innocent. If the wounds became infected or festered, you were guilty and faced punishment accordingly. Trial by combat was another option, where the accused would fight their accuser or a chosen champion. The assumption was that the gods would ensure victory for whoever was telling the truth. In practice, this meant that larger, stronger men had a significant advantage in the legal system, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. Punishments for crimes were swift and brutal. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Murderers could be executed on the spot or enslaved to the victim's family. Adultery was punished by exile or death, depending on the circumstances and the social status of those involved. There were no appeals, processes, or second chances. The concept of collective responsibility meant that entire families could be held accountable for individual crimes. If your brother killed someone and fled before facing justice, his victim's family might demand compensation from you instead. This created enormous pressure on families to police their own members and prevent actions that could bring disaster on everyone. Blood feuds could last for generations, with families obligated to seek revenge for wrongs committed against their ancestors. These cycles of violence consumed enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources that communities could ill afford. Young men grew up knowing they might be killed to settle debts they'd had no part in creating. The only way to escape a blood feud was through weregild, compensation paid to the victim's family to settle the debt. but these payments were often so large that they bankrupted entire households. A life's savings might not be enough to pay for a single killing, forcing families into debt bondage or slavery to meet their obligations. Women had virtually no legal rights in this system. They couldn't testify in legal proceedings, couldn't own property in their own names after marriage, and couldn't seek divorce except under the most extreme circumstances. A woman's value was determined entirely by her relationships to male family members. Widows and unmarried women were particularly vulnerable because they lacked male protection in a society that offered none to the defenseless. Religious beliefs permeated every aspect of Viking law and justice. Oaths were sworn on sacred rings or weapons, and breaking such oaths was believed to bring divine punishment. The gods were thought to actively intervene in human affairs, making their will known through omens, dreams, and the outcomes of battles or trials. This religious worldview shaped how Vikings understood concepts like fate, honor, and death. They believed that each person's lifespan was predetermined by the Norns, supernatural beings who wove the threads of destiny. This fatalistic outlook could be either comforting or terrifying, depending on your circumstances. Death in battle was considered the most honorable end for a warrior, guaranteeing entry into Valhalla, where the slain would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the final battle that would end the world. But this glorious afterlife was reserved for those who died with weapons in their hands. People who died of disease, old age, or accidents went to hell, a cold, miserable realm ruled by a half-dead goddess. This belief system created enormous pressure on young men to seek out violent confrontations to prove their courage and secure their place in the afterlife. Avoiding fights or showing cowardice could result in social exile and spiritual damnation. The concept of pacifism was literally unthinkable in a culture that equated violence with virtue. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes granted the same honored status as warriors, recognizing the mortal danger they faced in bringing new life into the world. But most women faced the prospect of spending eternity in the cold halls of hell, regardless of how virtuous or courageous their lives had been. The gods themselves were not benevolent protectors but capricious beings who demanded constant appeasement through sacrifices and rituals. Odin, the chief god, was known for breaking oaths and betraying even his most loyal followers when it suited his purposes. Thor might protect you from giants and monsters, but he was also quick to anger and might strike you down with lightning if you offended him. Religious ceremonies often involved animal sacrifices that doubled as community feasts. Horses, cattle, pigs, and other valuable livestock would be killed and offered to the gods, then consumed by the assembled worshippers. These events provided rare opportunities for the entire community to eat meat together, but they also represented enormous economic sacrifices for families who could barely afford to keep their animals alive through winter. Human sacrifice also occurred during particularly important ceremonies or times of crisis. Slaves were the usual victims, but free people might volunteer for sacrifice if they believed it would save their community from disaster. Archaeological evidence suggests that these sacrifices involved brutal deaths by hanging, drowning, or being beaten to death with clubs. The religious calendar was tied closely to the agricultural cycle, with major festivals marking the changing seasons and crucial farming periods. Winter solstice celebrations lasted for 12 days and nights, featuring enormous feasts that consumed much of a family's preserved food stores. These festivals were essential for maintaining morale during the darkest months, but they also represented a calculated gamble with survival. Spring festivals marked the beginning of the planting season, and included rituals designed to ensure good harvests. Summer celebrations occurred at the height of the growing season when food was most plentiful. Harvest festivals gave thanks for successful crops and prepared communities for the coming winter. But religious observance wasn't optional or purely spiritual. Failing to participate in community rituals could result in social ostracism or accusations of bringing bad luck on the entire settlement. The gods demanded proper respect, and communities that neglected their religious duties might face divine punishment in the form of failed crops, disease outbreaks, or enemy attacks. This constant need to maintain divine favor added another layer of stress and expense to already difficult lives. Families had to set aside portions of their scarce resources for religious offerings, participate in time-consuming ceremonies even when urgent work needed to be done, and live in fear that they might inadvertently offend supernatural powers beyond their understanding. The intersection of religion and daily survival created a worldview where every misfortune was interpreted as either divine punishment or the result of enemy magic. Crop failures, livestock diseases, and human illnesses were all seen as supernatural attacks that required supernatural responses. This led to a culture of constant suspicion where neighbors might be blamed for casting curses or practicing harmful magic. Accusations of witchcraft or sorcery were serious matters that could result in exile or death. Women were particularly vulnerable to such accusations, especially if they possessed knowledge of healing herbs or midwifery. Any unusual skill or knowledge might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural power, making it dangerous to stand out from the community in any way. The practice of seder, a form of Norse magic, was both feared and respected. Practitioners claimed the ability to see the future, influence weather patterns, heal diseases, or curse enemies. These abilities were considered powerful, but also potentially dangerous to both the practitioner and the community. Even successful magic users lived under constant suspicion and might be blamed for any misfortune that befell the settlement. This magical worldview extended to everyday objects and activities. Certain weapons, tools, or pieces of jewelry were believed to possess supernatural properties. Runes carved on objects could provide protection or bring good luck. Even simple activities like cooking or farming might involve ritual elements designed to ensure success and ward off evil influences. The complexity of these belief systems meant that Vikings had to navigate not just the physical challenges of survival, but also an elaborate supernatural landscape filled with invisible threats and opportunities. Every decision had potential religious implications, and every misfortune required both practical and spiritual responses. This combination of harsh physical conditions, brutal social hierarchies, primitive legal systems, and complex religious obligations created a world where simple survival required extraordinary resilience, adaptability, and sheer determination. The romanticized image of Vikings as fearless warriors sailing off to glorious adventures ignores the grinding reality of daily life in medieval Scandinavia, where most people struggled just to see another sunrise in a world that seemed determined to kill them in countless creative and terrible ways. Terrible ways. And yet, despite all these supernatural concerns and social pressures, Vikings still had to deal with the most immediate and relentless challenge of all: staying warm enough to survive the brutal Scandinavian winters. This wasn't just about comfort or convenience. This was about the difference between waking up in the morning and freezing to death in your sleep. Winter clothing was a matter of life and death, but it bore no resemblance to the cozy winter gear we take for granted today. There were no down jackets, no synthetic insulation, no waterproof materials. Everything was made from wool, leather, and fur, materials that had to be painstakingly prepared by hand using techniques passed down through generations. Your winter outfit would start with a linen undertunic next to your skin. This wasn't comfortable cotton underwear, but rough, scratchy linen that chafed constantly, but served the crucial purpose of wicking moisture away from your body. Over this went a woolen tunic, then another woolen tunic, and possibly a third if your family could afford the materials. The wool itself was nothing like the soft merino blends we know today. Viking wool was coarse, oily, and retained the strong smell of sheep no matter how thoroughly it was washed. It was also incredibly itchy against your skin, causing constant irritation that you simply had to endure because the alternative was freezing to death. Your legs would be wrapped in woolen leg bindings, long strips of cloth wound tightly from ankle to knee and held in place with leather cords. These provided some insulation but had to be rewrapped daily as they loosened with movement. Getting them tight enough to stay in place but not so tight as to cut off circulation was a skill that took years to master. Over all of this would go a thick woolen cloak fastened at the shoulder with a metal brooch. If your family was wealthy enough to own fur, it might line this cloak, but most people made do with extra layers of wool. The cloak had to be long enough to provide protection, but not so long that it dragged in the mud or caught on obstacles while working. Your head would be covered with a woolen cap that tied under your chin to prevent it from blowing away in the fierce northern winds. Your hands went into thick woolen mittens that made fine work impossible, but were essential for any outdoor activity. Gloves with individual fingers didn't exist because they provided less warmth than mittens where all your fingers could share body heat. On your feet went leather boots stuffed with straw or dried grass for insulation. These boots were not waterproof and offered minimal protection against cold or moisture. Your feet would be constantly damp and often numb during winter months. Frostbite was common, and many Vikings lost toes or entire feet to the cold. But even with all these layers, you'd still be cold most of the time. The wool was never quite dry because of the constant moisture in the air. The leather boots leaked. The cloak became heavy and stiff when wet. Moving around in all these layers was awkward and exhausting, but removing any of them could be fatal. Indoor heating was primitive and inefficient. The central hearth provided warmth only in a small radius around the fire. The rest of the longhouse remained barely above freezing even when the fire was burning well. Fuel was precious and had to be conserved, so fires were banked down at night and allowed to burn low during the day when everyone was working outside. The smoke from these fires was another constant torment. With no proper chimneys, smoke filled the interior of the longhouse, making your eyes water and your lungs burn. Everything you owned became permeated with smoke. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, even your food, absorbed the acrid smell of burning wood and animal fat. Sleep during winter was a dangerous time when your body temperature could drop to life-threatening levels. Families huddled together under piles of woolen blankets and fur covers, sharing body heat to survive the night. Children and elderly people often slept between younger adults who could provide more warmth. Privacy was impossible because survival depended on staying close together. The platforms where families slept were raised off the ground to avoid the worst of the cold that settled near the floor, but they were still uncomfortable surfaces covered only with straw or seaweed mattresses. You'd go to sleep wearing most of your clothes, adding extra layers rather than undressing for bed. Hot stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth provided temporary warmth for the sickest or most vulnerable family members, but these cooled quickly and had to be reheated frequently. Some families used heated sand or grain in cloth bags as primitive warming devices, but fuel was often too precious to waste on such luxuries. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats that every Viking family faced. The early signs of frostbite, the tingling and numbness in fingers and toes, were so common that people barely noticed them anymore. More severe cases resulted in blackened skin and eventual amputation of affected digits. Many Vikings lived with permanent disabilities caused by cold injuries. Hypothermia was an even greater danger because it could kill quickly and quietly. The early stages, shivering and confusion, were often mistaken for other illnesses. By the time someone realized a family member was dying from cold exposure, it was often too late to save them. Every winter brought deaths from hypothermia, particularly among the very young and very old. The psychological effects of constant cold were as damaging as the physical ones. People became irritable and depressed during the long, dark winter months. Cabin fever wasn't just a modern concept, it was a real phenomenon that led to violence and conflict within families forced to live in close quarters for months at a time. Food during winter presented its own set of challenges that went far beyond simple nutrition. Everything had to be preserved through techniques that were labor-intensive, unreliable, and often resulted in food that was barely edible by the time it was consumed. Meat preservation was particularly difficult in the damp Scandinavian climate. Smoking was the most common method, but it required constant attention to maintain the right temperature and smoke levels. Too little smoke and the meat would rot. Too much heat and it would cook rather than preserve. The process took days or weeks, during which the meat had to be protected from rain, animals, and theft. Salting was another preservation technique, but salt was expensive and difficult to obtain in inland areas. Families might trade valuable goods like furs or amber for small quantities of salt, then use it sparingly to preserve only the most important cuts of meat. The heavily salted meat that resulted was almost inedible without extensive soaking to remove the excess salt. Fish preservation followed similar patterns. Cod and other fish were split, salted, and dried on wooden racks exposed to wind and sun. This process could take weeks and often failed if weather conditions weren't perfect. Dried fish became hard as wood and had to be soaked and boiled extensively before it could be eaten. Dairy preservation relied on fermentation processes that were poorly understood and frequently failed. Milk was turned into various types of sour milk products, hard cheeses, and fermented butter that could last for months if properly prepared. But the lack of understanding about bacteria and fermentation meant that many batches spoiled, representing huge losses of valuable protein and calories. Grain storage required elaborate precautions against moisture, rodents, and insects. Large wooden chests lined with stones or metal were used to protect grain from mice and rats. The grain itself had to be completely dry before storage, or it would develop mold that could poison anyone who ate it. Even properly stored grain gradually lost nutritional value and became infested with weevils and other insects. Root vegetables went into underground storage pits lined with straw and covered with earth and stones. These pits had to be carefully constructed to drain properly while maintaining the right temperature and humidity levels. Too much moisture in the vegetables would rot. Too little, and they would freeze and become inedible. The preserved foods that sustained Vikings through winter were barely recognizable as food by modern standards. Smoked meat was blackened, tough, and intensely salty. Dried fish resembled pieces of leather more than anything edible. Fermented dairy products had strong, unpleasant odors and flavors. Stored grains often contained significant amounts of chaff, dirt, and insect parts. Preparing these preserved foods for consumption required considerable effort and skill. Dried meats had to be soaked for hours or days to become soft enough to chew. Salt had to be carefully removed to make the food palatable. Moldy or spoiled portions had to be cut away and discarded, reducing already limited food supplies. Cooking facilities were primitive and dangerous. The central fire was used for all food preparation, requiring constant attention to prevent burning while ensuring food was cooked thoroughly enough to be safe. Iron pots and cauldrons were expensive and had to last for generations, so they were carefully maintained and shared among multiple families. Water for cooking often came from melted snow or ice, which had to be collected and stored in wooden containers that frequently froze solid. Breaking ice to obtain water was dangerous work that could result in serious injuries from sharp ice fragments or falls on slippery surfaces. The monotonous winter diet led to serious nutritional deficiencies that weakened immune systems and made Vikings vulnerable to diseases. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C was common, causing teeth to fall out and wounds to heal poorly. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency made it dangerous to move around after dark. Various other vitamin and mineral deficiencies caused a host of health problems that Vikings had no way to understand or treat. Hunger was a constant companion during the lean months of late winter and early spring when preserved foods ran low, but new crops were still months away from harvest. Families rationed their remaining food supplies carefully, often going days between substantial meals. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable during these periods of scarcity. The psychological stress of never having enough food affected every aspect of Viking society. Families hoarded whatever surplus they could manage, often hiding food supplies from neighbors and relatives. Theft of food was considered one of the most serious crimes because it could mean death for the victim's family. Trust within communities eroded as survival instincts overrode social bonds. This constant struggle with hunger and cold created a culture where physical toughness and endurance were valued above almost all other qualities. Vikings who couldn't endure hardship didn't survive long enough to pass their weaknesses on to the next generation. The harsh environment acted as a brutal filter that eliminated anyone who wasn't exceptionally resilient. Women faced additional challenges during winter months when pregnancy and childbirth occurred in the worst possible conditions. Pregnant women had to maintain their normal work schedules despite inadequate nutrition and brutal cold. Childbirth in unheated buildings with no medical assistance resulted in high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Children born during winter faced immediate threats to their survival. Newborns couldn't regulate their body temperature effectively and often died from cold exposure in the first few days of life. Those who survived infancy still faced months of inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to disease in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the longhouse. The elderly became increasingly vulnerable as their ability to generate body heat declined with age. Many older Vikings didn't survive their first serious winter illness because their weakened bodies couldn't fight off infections while also maintaining core body temperature. Families faced heartbreaking decisions about how to allocate limited food and fuel resources among members with different chances of survival. This harsh reality of winter survival created social structures and cultural practices that seem alien to modern sensibilities. The weak were often abandoned or neglected because supporting them threatened the survival of stronger family members. Infanticide of weak or deformed babies was practiced openly because families couldn't afford to invest resources in children unlikely to survive. The coming of spring brought its own challenges as families emerged from winter, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and constant cold exposure. The transition period was particularly dangerous because Viking immune systems were compromised just as they faced increased contact with neighbors and travelers who might carry diseases. Early spring was also the time when food supplies reached their lowest point. The preserved foods from the previous year were nearly exhausted, but new crops wouldn't be ready for harvest for several more months. This period, known as the Hunger Gap, was when many Vikings died not from cold, but from simple starvation. Yet, despite all these challenges, Vikings not only survived, but created a complex civilization that spread across much of northern Europe and beyond. Their ability to endure such harsh conditions while maintaining sophisticated social structures, artistic traditions, and technological innovation speaks to a level of human resilience that's difficult for modern people to comprehend. The daily reality of Viking life was a constant struggle against environmental forces that seemed determined to kill anyone foolish enough to try living in medieval Scandinavia. Every day brought new threats and challenges that required immediate attention and swift action. There was no time for the luxury of complaint or self-pity because survival demanded constant vigilance and effort. This unforgiving environment shaped every aspect of Viking culture, from their religious beliefs to their social structures to their concepts of honor and courage. The harsh realities of daily survival created a people who were tough, resourceful, and utterly realistic about the dangers they faced. They couldn't afford the luxury of false optimism or denial because miscalculating the threats around them meant death for themselves and their families. The relationship between survival and violence in Viking society was inescapable and brutal in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. This wasn't a civilization where disputes were settled through lawyers or mediation. When conflicts arose, and they arose constantly, the resolution usually involved sharp objects and a willingness to use them without hesitation. Personal honor wasn't just a philosophical concept for Vikings. It was a tangible asset that determined whether you lived or died, whether your family ate or starved, whether you slept safely or spent every night wondering if enemies were approaching your door. Losing your reputation for courage meant social death in a world where social death quickly became actual death. The concept of the holmgang, or formal duel, exemplified this violent approach to problem solving. When serious disputes couldn't be resolved through negotiation or compensation, the involved parties might agree to settle matters through single combat. These weren't gentlemen's duels with elaborate rules and seconds. They were brutal fights to the death conducted on small islands or marked ground where retreat was impossible. The weapons used in holmgang were typically swords and shields, though axes and spears were also acceptable. The combatants would take turns striking at each other until one was killed or too badly wounded to continue. There were minimal rules beyond the basic framework of taking turns and staying within the designated combat area. Killing your opponent was not only acceptable, but expected. These duels weren't rare occurrences reserved for major conflicts. Vikings used holmgang to settle disputes over property, inheritance, marriage rights, and perceived insults. A merchant who felt cheated in a trade might challenge his trading partner to combat. A man who believed his wife had been insulted might demand satisfaction through sword point. Even relatively minor social slights could escalate into mortal combat. The psychology behind this system was rooted in the belief that the gods would ensure victory for whoever was in the right. This divine intervention theory meant that losing a duel didn't just cost you your life, it proved to the entire community that you had been wrong from the beginning. Your death served as divine judgment that validated your opponent's position. Women couldn't participate directly in holmgang, but they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. This created a market for professional fighters who made their living settling other people's disputes through violence. These champions were typically landless men with exceptional fighting skills and a willingness to risk their lives for payment. The champions themselves lived dangerous lives with high mortality rates. Even the most skilled fighters eventually faced opponents who were faster, stronger, or simply luckier. A champion might win dozens of duels only to die in his next fight, leaving behind no legacy except the disputes he'd settled with his sword. Beyond formal duels, everyday violence was woven into the fabric of Viking society in ways that would seem psychotic by modern standards. Tavern brawls regularly ended in death. Disagreements at markets might be settled with knives. Even family disputes could turn lethal when honor was perceived to be at stake. The weapons Vikings carried weren't ceremonial or symbolic. Every free man owned at least a knife and usually an axe or sword. These weren't kept locked away in storage, but carried daily as essential tools for both work and self-defense. A man who ventured outside without weapons was considered either foolish or suicidal. The quality of your weapons directly reflected your social status and fighting ability. A wealthy jarl might own a pattern-welded sword with intricate decorations and a blade that held its edge through countless battles. A poor farmer might make do with a simple iron knife and a wooden club reinforced with metal studs. But regardless of quality, everyone was expected to know how to use their weapons effectively. Training for combat began in childhood and never really ended. Boys learned to handle knives, axes, and swords as soon as they were old enough to hold them safely. Girls received less formal weapons training, but still learned basic self-defense techniques because raids and attacks could come without warning. The training wasn't conducted in safe, controlled environments with protective equipment. Young Vikings learned to fight by actually fighting, accepting that serious injuries were inevitable parts of the educational process. Broken bones, deep cuts, and permanent scars were considered normal consequences of weapons training. Mock battles using real weapons were common forms of entertainment at feasts and gatherings. These contests could become quite serious as participants, often drunk and eager to prove their courage, struck harder and took greater risks than prudent. Deaths during supposedly friendly competitions were frequent enough to be unremarkable. The raiding culture that Vikings are famous for was an extension of this everyday violence rather than a separate military tradition. Young men who had proven themselves in local conflicts were naturally recruited for larger expeditions against distant targets. Raiding wasn't a specialized profession, but an opportunity for ordinary Vikings to apply their existing fighting skills on a larger scale. The decision to join a raid wasn't taken lightly because the mortality rates were extraordinarily high. Even successful raids often lost significant percentages of their participants to combat, disease, storms, or simple accidents. The promise of wealth and glory had to be weighed against the very real possibility of never returning home. Raiding expeditions were brutal affairs that bore no resemblance to the romanticized adventures depicted in popular culture. These weren't noble quests or glorious battles between equals. They were calculated attacks on defenseless targets designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk to the attackers. The preferred targets were monasteries, trading posts, and small settlements that couldn't mount effective resistance. Vikings specifically avoided attacking well-defended fortifications or large armies because the goal was easy wealth, not heroic combat. Courage in battle was admired, but stupidity that led to unnecessary casualties was condemned. When raiders did encounter resistance, the fighting was savage and without mercy. There were no rules of engagement or conventions governing the treatment of prisoners. Enemies who surrendered might be enslaved, ransomed, or killed depending on their perceived value and the raiders' immediate needs. The treatment of civilian populations during raids was particularly horrific by modern standards. Men who couldn't fight effectively were often killed to eliminate potential resistance and reduce the number of mouths to feed during the return journey. Women and children were valuable as slaves, but also represented logistical challenges that raiders might solve through execution if circumstances demanded it. Sexual violence during raids was systematic and accepted as a normal part of warfare. Women captives were routinely raped by their captors, both as a form of entertainment and as a method of demonstrating dominance over conquered populations. These assaults weren't aberrations committed by undisciplined troops, but standard practices that Viking society considered legitimate spoils of war. The psychological impact on raiding participants was severe, but rarely acknowledged. Modern soldiers received counseling and support for post-traumatic stress, but Vikings were expected to process the horrors they'd witnessed and committed without any assistance. Many raiders returned home fundamentally changed by their experiences, struggling with nightmares, rage, and an inability to readjust to peaceful domestic life. The economic incentives for raiding created a vicious cycle where communities that had been attacked often organized retaliatory raids against their attackers. This led to escalating conflicts that could persist for generations, with each side justifying their violence as revenge for previous attacks. The line between raiders and victims became blurred as formerly peaceful settlements transformed into armed camps preparing for the next assault. The slave trade that fueled much of the raiding economy was particularly brutal and dehumanizing. Captured slaves were treated as livestock, chained together for transport and sold in markets where buyers examined them like animals. Families were routinely separated with no consideration for emotional bonds between parents and children or husbands and wives. The transportation of slaves involved long, dangerous journeys under conditions that killed significant percentages of the captives before they reached their final destinations. Slaves who became sick or injured during transport were often abandoned to die rather than slow down the caravan. Those who survived the journey faced lives of unending labor and abuse in foreign lands where they couldn't even speak the language. The profits from slave trading funded further raids and created incentives for Viking communities to specialize in human trafficking. Entire settlements might focus their economic activities around capturing, processing, and selling human beings like any other commodity. The moral implications of this trade were simply not considered relevant in a culture that viewed slaves as property rather than people. The weapons and tactics used in raids evolved constantly as Vikings adapted to changing circumstances and defensive measures. Early raids relied heavily on surprise attacks launched from fast ships that could appear suddenly and disappear before organized resistance could be mounted. As coastal communities improved their defenses, raiders had to develop new strategies and equipment to maintain their effectiveness. Ship design became increasingly sophisticated as Vikings learned to balance speed, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness for different types of expeditions. Raiding vessels needed to be fast and maneuverable to escape pursuit, but they also had to carry enough warriors and supplies for extended campaigns. The famous longships represented engineering compromises between these competing requirements. The development of specialized raiding equipment showed how thoroughly Vikings had thought through the logistics of violence. Portable bridges for crossing rivers, scaling ladders for attacking fortifications, and even prefabricated siege engines demonstrated a level of military planning that contradicted popular images of berserker warriors charging blindly into battle. Intelligence gathering before raids was crucial for success and survival. Vikings developed extensive networks of informants who provided information about target locations, defensive capabilities, and the timing of valuable cargo movements. Merchants, travelers, and even slaves who had escaped from previous raids all contributed intelligence that made future attacks more effective. The seasonal nature of raiding reflected both practical limitations and cultural preferences. Most expeditions were launched during spring and summer, when weather conditions favored sea travel, and targets were most likely to have accumulated wealth worth stealing. Winter raids were rare because the combination of harsh weather and reduced daylight made them extremely dangerous even by Viking standards. The return from successful raids brought its own challenges as communities had to deal with sudden influxes of wealth, slaves, and traumatized warriors. The distribution of loot often led to conflicts within raiding parties as participants argued over shares and accused each other of hiding valuable items. These disputes could escalate into violence that undermined the unity of the community. The integration of slaves into Viking society created ongoing tensions and security concerns. Slaves vastly outnumbered their owners in many households, creating constant fear of rebellion or escape attempts. The need to guard slaves and prevent uprisings required significant resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to productive activities. The children of slaves occupied an ambiguous position in Viking society that created additional complications. Some slave children were eventually freed or achieved higher status through their relationships with free family members. Others remained in bondage their entire lives, despite being born and raised in Viking communities. These inconsistencies created confusion and resentment among both slaves and free people. The cultural impact of constant raiding and slavery on Viking society was profound and lasting. Children grew up accepting violence as a normal part of life and viewing other human beings as potential property rather than fellow people deserving of respect. This normalization of brutality affected every aspect of social interaction and moral reasoning. The religious justifications for raiding and slavery were elaborate and deeply embedded in Viking mythology and cosmology. The gods themselves were portrayed as warriors who gained honor through combat and acquired treasures through conquest. Odin was specifically associated with battle and death, making violence seem not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. The concept of fate played a crucial role in justifying the suffering inflicted on raid victims and slaves. Vikings believed that everyone's destiny was predetermined, so enslaving captives or killing enemies was simply fulfilling the will of the gods rather than making moral choices. This fatalistic worldview absolved raiders of responsibility for their actions, while encouraging them to pursue violence without guilt or hesitation. The heroic literature that celebrated raiding exploits reinforced these values and transmitted them to future generations. Saga stories that glorified successful raiders and their achievements served as entertainment, education, and moral instruction for young Vikings who aspired to similar careers in violence and exploitation. The archaeological evidence for Viking raiding reveals details that the literary sources often omit or sanitize. Excavations of raided monasteries show evidence of systematic destruction that goes beyond simple looting. Buildings were burned, religious artifacts were deliberately defiled, and victims' bodies were mutilated in ways that suggest the attacks were motivated by hatred as much as greed. The mass graves found at some raiding sites contain remains that tell stories of extreme violence and suffering. Skeletons show evidence of torture, execution-style killings, and injuries that would have caused prolonged agony before death. These findings suggest that raids were often exercises in terrorism designed to intimidate surviving populations as much as opportunities for material gain. The impact of Viking raiding on European development was enormous and long-lasting. Entire regions were depopulated as communities fled to more defensible locations or were simply wiped out by repeated attacks. Trade networks were disrupted. Technological development was slowed, and social progress was reversed as resources were diverted from construction and education to defense and survival. The psychological trauma inflicted on European populations by centuries of Viking raiding created cultural changes that persisted long after the raids themselves ended. Communities developed fortress mentalities that emphasized security over prosperity and viewed strangers as potential threats rather than opportunities for beneficial interaction. This defensive mindset hindered cultural exchange and economic development for generations. Yet, for all its brutality and destructiveness, the raiding culture also served important functions within Viking society itself. It provided opportunities for landless young men to acquire wealth and status that would otherwise have been impossible to achieve. It created outlets for aggressive impulses that might otherwise have torn communities apart through internal violence. And it established the military traditions and technologies that would eventually enable Vikings to establish lasting settlements and trade networks across vast distances. The transformation of Vikings from raiders to settlers and traders didn't happen overnight or without struggle. Many communities found it difficult to abandon the raiding lifestyle that had provided wealth and excitement for generations. The transition to peaceful agricultural and commercial activities seemed boring and unrewarding compared to the adrenaline rush of successful raids. The skills and attitudes that made Vikings effective raiders often hindered their success as farmers or merchants. The willingness to use violence to solve problems didn't translate well to situations that required patience, cooperation, and long-term planning. Many former raiders struggled to adapt to the social constraints and economic realities of settled life. The wealth accumulated through raiding sometimes enabled Vikings to establish themselves as legitimate rulers or merchants in foreign lands, but it also created suspicions and resentments that complicated their integration into existing societies. Communities that had suffered from Viking attacks were understandably reluctant to accept former raiders as peaceful neighbors and trading partners. This violent heritage continued to influence Viking culture, even as their society evolved toward greater complexity and sophistication. The values of courage, honor, and individual achievement that had been essential for successful raiding remained central to Viking identity long after most had abandoned the raiding lifestyle. The weapons culture that permeated every aspect of Viking society extended far beyond the raids and formal duels we've just explored. In your daily life as a Viking, you'd be surrounded by sharp metal implements designed for killing, and the line between tool and weapon was often non-existent. The same axe you used to chop firewood could split a human skull just as easily, and everyone around you knew it. Your most essential possession would be your seaweed, a single-edged knife that served as eating utensil, work tool, and backup weapon all rolled into one. This wasn't a small pocket knife, but a substantial blade anywhere from 6 to 18 inches long, worn openly on your belt where everyone could see it. The quality of your seaweed announced your wealth and status as clearly as expensive jewelry might today. A well-made seaweed required months of work by a skilled blacksmith. The iron had to be heated, folded, and hammered repeatedly to create a blade that would hold an edge while remaining flexible enough not to shatter on impact. Pattern welding, where different types of steel were twisted together, created blades with distinctive wavy patterns that were both beautiful and functional. Only the wealthy could afford such weapons. Most Vikings made do with cruder blades forged from whatever iron they could obtain. Bog iron, smelted from deposits found in marshes and swamps, provided the raw material for most tools and weapons. The smelting process was labor-intensive and inefficient, requiring huge amounts of charcoal and producing relatively small amounts of usable metal. The constant maintenance required by iron tools and weapons consumed enormous amounts of time and effort. Your seaweed needed daily sharpening to remain effective, and the whetstones required for this task had to be carefully selected and maintained. A dull blade wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous, because it required more force to cut, increasing the chances of accidents that could cripple or kill you. Rust was another constant enemy that attacked metal implements relentlessly in the damp Scandinavian climate. Your weapons had to be oiled regularly with animal fat to prevent corrosion, and even then, red stains of oxidation would appear if you neglected them for even a few days. A rusted blade could fail at a critical moment, leaving you defenseless when your life depended on sharp metal. The social protocols surrounding weapons were complex and strictly enforced. Drawing your seaweed inappropriately could be interpreted as a threat that demanded immediate response. Touching another man's weapon without permission was a serious insult that might lead to violence. Even the way you wore your blade sent messages about your intentions and your willingness to use it. Women weren't excluded from this weapons culture entirely. While they couldn't carry swords or participate in formal combat, many women owned and knew how to use knives for both domestic tasks and self-defense. A woman working alone in the fields or traveling between settlements needed to be prepared to defend herself against both human and animal threats. The presence of weapons in every household meant that domestic disputes could turn lethal with terrifying speed. Arguments between spouses, siblings, or neighbors that might result in harsh words in other societies could escalate to bloodshed when everyone carried sharp metal implements. Family violence wasn't just emotional or physical abuse, but potentially fatal encounters with edged weapons. Children grew up handling dangerous implements from an early age because survival required practical skills that couldn't wait for adulthood. A 10-year-old boy needed to know how to use an axe to help gather firewood, even though the same tool could easily kill him if he made a mistake. The casualty rates from accidents involving children and weapons were horrifically high, but the alternative was raising helpless adults who couldn't survive in a dangerous world. The economics of weapon ownership created additional pressures on Viking families already struggling with basic survival. A good sword might cost the equivalent of several years' income for an ordinary farmer, but going without proper weapons could mean death during conflicts or raids. Families faced agonizing choices between spending resources on weapons or food, knowing that either decision could prove fatal. Inheritance of weapons followed strict protocols that sometimes superseded normal property distribution. A father's sword might go to his eldest son regardless of other inheritance arrangements, ensuring that the family's most valuable weapon remained with the person most likely to use it effectively. These weapons often acquired names and reputations that lasted for generations. The spiritual significance of weapons in Viking culture added another layer of complexity to their practical importance. Many blades were believed to possess supernatural qualities that could influence the outcome of battles or protect their owners from harm. Runes carved into sword hilts weren't just decoration, but magical formulas intended to enhance the weapon's effectiveness. The forging of weapons was itself a semi-magical process that required not just technical skill, but spiritual preparation. Blacksmiths were often viewed with suspicion and respect because their ability to transform raw iron into deadly implements seemed to border on sorcery. The timing of forging, the phases of the moon, and the rituals performed during the process were all believed to affect the final product. Blood sacrifice during weapon forging was practiced by some smiths who believed that feeding iron with human or animal blood would create superior blades. Whether this had any actual metallurgical effect is debatable, but the psychological impact on both smith and owner was significant. A blade forged with blood sacrifice was believed to thirst for more blood once drawn. The testing of new weapons involved practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. Swords were often tested on slaves or prisoners to ensure they could cut through bone and muscle effectively. A blade that failed to perform satisfactorily during these tests might be reforged or discarded entirely, regardless of the human cost of the testing process. The social rituals surrounding new weapons included ceremonies where the owner would swear oaths on the blade, dedicating it to specific gods or purposes. These weren't empty formalities, but serious spiritual commitments that bound the weapon's owner to particular codes of behavior. Breaking such oaths was believed to bring divine punishment that could extend to the owner's entire family. The burial of weapons with their owners reflected beliefs about the afterlife that made practical survival skills relevant even after death. Warriors were interred with their swords, axes, and shields because they would need these implements in Valhalla's endless battles. The quality of burial weapons often reflected the deceased's status and the family's expectations about their role in the afterlife. Women of high status were sometimes buried with weapons as well, though these were typically smaller knives or symbolic items rather than full battle gear. This practice suggests that the association between personal worth and weapon ownership extended beyond simple gender roles to encompass broader concepts of honor and capability. The archaeological evidence for Viking weapons reveals details about their construction and use that literary sources often omit. Microscopic analysis of blade edges shows wear patterns consistent with cutting both organic materials and human bone. Chemical analysis reveals that many weapons were used for mundane tasks like food preparation and craft work as well as combat. The distribution of weapon finds across Viking territories shows how thoroughly militarized their society had become. Even small farming settlements that never participated in raids contain numerous weapons, suggesting that the threat of violence was omnipresent and required constant preparation. There was no such thing as a purely peaceful Viking community. The evolution of weapon designs over time reflects changing combat conditions and technological innovations. Early Viking weapons were relatively simple and designed primarily for individual combat. Later examples show influences from other cultures and adaptations for fighting against different types of armor and defensive tactics. The trade in weapons connected Viking communities across vast distances and created networks of specialized craftsmen who shared techniques and innovations. A sword, forged in Denmark, might incorporate steel from the Rhine Valley and techniques learned from Frankish smiths. This exchange of knowledge accelerated weapons development and spread effective designs throughout Viking territories. The relationship between weapon ownership and legal status was fundamental to Viking society. Free men had the right and obligation to bear arms, while slaves were forbidden from owning weapons under penalty of death. This legal distinction reinforced social hierarchies and made armed rebellion by slaves extremely difficult to organize or sustain. The training required to use weapons effectively began in childhood and continued throughout a man's life. This wasn't casual instruction but intensive, dangerous education that resulted in numerous injuries and occasional deaths. Boys who couldn't master weapons skills faced limited options in a society that valued martial prowess above almost all other capabilities. The psychological conditioning required to use weapons against other humans was achieved through gradual exposure to violence and cultural reinforcement of aggressive values. Young Vikings learned to view enemies as less than human, making it easier to kill them without guilt or hesitation. This dehumanization process was essential for maintaining a warrior culture. The medical knowledge required to treat weapon injuries was surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting that Viking healers had extensive experience dealing with cuts, punctures, and trauma. Surgical techniques for removing embedded weapon points and treating severed arteries were well developed, though the lack of antiseptics meant that infection remained a major threat. The seasonal patterns of violence reflected both practical limitations and cultural preferences. Most conflicts occurred during warmer months when travel was easier and communities had surplus energy for fighting. Winter violence was typically limited to domestic disputes and blood feuds that couldn't wait for better weather. The impact of constant weapon carrying on social interactions was profound and lasting. Conversations were more formal and respectful when everyone present was armed and capable of violence. Insults were rarer and more carefully considered when they might provoke immediate lethal response. The presence of weapons enforced a kind of armed politeness that kept many conflicts from escalating. Yet this same weapons culture also created opportunities for social mobility that wouldn't have existed otherwise. A skilled warrior from a poor family could potentially gain wealth and status through successful combat, either in formal duels or military campaigns. Weapons skills provided one of the few paths upward through Viking social hierarchies. The religious festivals and ceremonies that punctuated the Viking calendar often included weapon displays and combat demonstrations that reinforced martial values while providing entertainment. These events served as informal training opportunities where techniques could be shared and new fighters could be evaluated by community leaders. The stories and songs that preserved Viking cultural memory were filled with weapons and their wielders, creating literary traditions that glorified violence while teaching practical lessons about combat tactics and warrior virtues. Children learned about proper behavior and social values through tales of heroes and their legendary blades. The economic impact of weapons production on Viking society was substantial. requiring significant investments in raw materials, specialized labor, and fuel for forges. Communities that couldn't support local weaponsmiths had to trade valuable goods for implements that might mean the difference between survival and destruction during conflicts. The theft of weapons was considered one of the most serious crimes in Viking society because it left victims defenseless while arming potential enemies. Punishments for weapon theft were severe and often involved mutilation or death, reflecting the vital importance of these implements for personal and community security. The repair and maintenance of damaged weapons required specialized knowledge and tools that weren't available in every community. A broken sword might have to be carried hundreds of miles to reach a smith capable of proper repairs, leaving its owner vulnerable during the journey and unable to defend himself effectively. The development of fighting techniques and tactical innovations occurred through brutal trial and error processes where unsuccessful experiments resulted in death rather than mere failure. Combat methods that proved effective in real battles were passed down through generations of warriors, while ineffective techniques disappeared along with their practitioners. The psychological warfare aspects of weapon display were as important as their practical combat applications. Showing high-quality weapons could intimidate potential enemies and avoid actual fighting, while concealing weapons might allow for surprise attacks or reduce the chances of provoking conflicts. The ceremonial uses of weapons extended beyond their practical applications to include religious rituals, legal proceedings, and social ceremonies where blades were used to seal oaths, mark important transitions, or demonstrate allegiance to particular leaders or gods. This pervasive weapons culture created a society where violence was not just accepted, but expected, where every social interaction occurred in the shadow of potential lethal force, and where survival depended as much on your willingness to kill as your ability to farm, trade, or craft. For modern people accustomed to resolving disputes through law and compromise, the Viking world would seem like an endless nightmare of paranoia and brutality, where death lurked behind every disagreement and trust was a luxury few could afford. Yet, this same harsh environment also produced remarkable achievements in exploration, trade, craftsmanship, and storytelling that continue to fascinate us more than 1,000 years later. The weapons that made Viking society so dangerous also enabled their expansion across oceans and continents, creating connections between distant cultures and establishing settlements that would grow into major cities. The violence that characterized their daily lives was inextricably linked to the courage and determination that allowed them to thrive in one of history's most challenging environments. And as you drift off to sleep tonight in your safe, comfortable bed, surrounded by modern conveniences and protected by laws that make casual violence unthinkable, perhaps you can appreciate just how far human civilization has come from those brutal days when survival meant carrying sharp metal everywhere you went and being prepared to use it without hesitation or remorse. The legal system that governed this violent society was equally unforgiving, and would leave you completely bewildered if you tried to navigate it with modern expectations of justice and due process. There were no courthouses, no professional judges, no lawyers arguing cases based on legal precedent. Instead, justice was administered at local assemblies called things, where free men gathered in the open air to hear disputes and render verdicts based on custom, testimony, and often pure speculation about divine will. If someone accused you of theft, murder, or any other serious crime, you wouldn't get the benefit of presumed innocence or the right to remain silent. The burden was on you to prove your innocence through methods that ranged from producing witnesses to undergoing brutal physical ordeals that were believed to reveal the truth through divine intervention. Trial by ordeal was a cornerstone of Viking justice that makes modern legal proceedings look like gentle philosophical discussions. If you were accused of stealing your neighbor's livestock, You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces while the assembled community watched for signs of divine judgment. Your hands would be wrapped in cloth and sealed, then examined 3 days later. If the burns showed signs of infection or failed to heal properly, you were declared guilty and faced immediate punishment. Another popular ordeal involved plunging your arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone from the bottom of a cauldron. The logic was identical. The gods would protect the innocent while allowing the guilty to suffer permanent injury. The psychological torture of waiting 3 days to learn your fate was considered part of the divine process of revelation. Trial by cold water offered a different but equally terrifying approach to determining guilt or innocence. You would be bound and thrown into a body of water while the community watched to see if you floated or sank. Sinking meant innocence because the pure water had accepted you. Floating proved guilt because the water had rejected your corrupted body. Either way, survival was far from guaranteed, especially if you'd never learned to swim. The witnesses who testified at these assemblies weren't required to have actually seen the alleged crime, or even know the participants personally. Character witnesses could speak about your general reputation or past behavior, and their testimony carried significant weight in determining your fate. If you'd made enemies through previous disputes or antisocial behavior, finding favorable witnesses could prove impossible. Oath swearing played a crucial role in legal proceedings, but it wasn't the simple promise to tell the truth that modern courts require. Viking oaths were sworn on sacred objects like arm rings worn by priests or weapons believed to possess supernatural power. Breaking such an oath was thought to bring immediate divine punishment, making perjury a literally life-threatening act. The value of a person's oath varied dramatically based on their social status and reputation. A jarl's word carried far more weight than a carl's, and a carl's testimony was infinitely more credible than anything a slave might say. Women's oaths were generally considered less reliable than men's, and foreigners or recent arrivals had virtually no credibility at all in legal proceedings. Compensation rather than punishment was the preferred resolution for most crimes, assuming guilt could be established through ordeal or testimony. Every offense had an established price in silver, livestock, or goods that could satisfy the victim's family and restore peace to the community. Murder might cost 30 cattle or their equivalent value. Theft could be settled for twice the value of the stolen goods plus additional penalties. But these compensation payments, called weregild, were often so large that they bankrupted entire families and created cycles of debt that lasted for generations. If you couldn't pay the required compensation immediately, you might be forced into debt bondage or slavery until the obligation was satisfied. Your children could inherit these debts and spend their entire lives working to pay for crimes they'd had no part in committing. Blood feuds arose when families refused to accept compensation or couldn't agree on appropriate amounts. These vengeance cycles could persist for decades as each side sought to even the score through violence that inevitably led to new grievances requiring new revenge. The mathematical logic was simple. Your family killed one of ours, so we kill one of yours. But the practical result was ongoing warfare between households. The legal system provided no protection for the weak or vulnerable members of society. Slaves had no legal rights whatsoever and could be killed, beaten, or abused without any legal consequences for their owners. Children were considered property of their fathers until they reached adulthood. If they survived that long, women had extremely limited rights and couldn't initiate legal proceedings without male guardians to represent them. Punishments for those who couldn't or wouldn't pay compensation were swift and brutal. Execution might be carried out immediately after the assembly reached its verdict, with no appeals, process, or opportunity for last-minute clemency. The methods of execution were deliberately painful and public, serving as entertainment for the community, while demonstrating the consequences of challenging social order. Outlawry was considered a fate worse than death, because it stripped away all legal protections and social connections. An outlaw could be killed by anyone without legal consequences, couldn't seek shelter or assistance from former friends, and was forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies or community activities. They became non-persons who existed outside the protection of both human law and divine favor. The enforcement of legal decisions depended entirely on community cooperation and the willingness of individual families to seek justice through violence. There were no professional law enforcement officers or centralized authority to ensure compliance with assembly verdicts. If someone refused to pay required compensation or ignored a legal judgment, their victims had to organize their own enforcement actions. This system created enormous pressure for conformity and social cohesion because stepping outside accepted norms could result in complete isolation from the community support networks that survival required. Eccentricity wasn't just discouraged, it was potentially fatal in a world where group membership meant the difference between protection and vulnerability. The legal proceedings themselves were as much political theater as judicial inquiry. Powerful families used assemblies to demonstrate their influence and settle scores with rivals under the guise of seeking justice. The outcome of many cases was determined more by political alliances and social connections than by evidence or legal principles. Young men learned to navigate this treacherous legal landscape through observation and hard experience, often suffering severe consequences for mistakes that would be minor infractions in modern legal systems. Speaking out of turn, showing disrespect to higher status individuals, or failing to follow proper protocols could result in legal sanctions that destroyed their future prospects. The seasonal timing of assemblies was carefully coordinated with agricultural cycles and weather patterns to ensure maximum participation while minimizing disruption to essential survival activities. Major legal proceedings typically occurred during spring or fall when travel was possible, but farming duties were less demanding. The physical layout of assembly sites reflected social hierarchies and legal traditions that reinforced existing power structures. Higher status individuals sat in positions of honor, while lower-ranking community members stood at the periphery where they could observe but not easily participate in discussions. The role of memory in preserving legal precedents was crucial in a largely illiterate society where written records were rare and expensive. Elderly men who could remember previous cases and their outcomes served as living libraries of legal knowledge, though their recollections might be influenced by personal biases or failing memory. The integration of religious beliefs into legal proceedings meant that every trial was also a spiritual event, where divine forces were believed to actively intervene in human affairs. This supernatural dimension added psychological pressure to all participants while providing religious justification for whatever outcome emerged from the proceedings. The impact of legal decisions extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect entire extended families and social networks. A single adverse judgment could destroy the reputation and prospects of dozens of people who shared kinship ties or political associations with the accused party. The absence of privacy or confidentiality in legal proceedings meant that every dispute became public knowledge that could be used for or against you in future conflicts. Personal secrets revealed during trials became ammunition for enemies and could haunt individuals for the rest of their lives. The economic costs of participating in legal proceedings were substantial, requiring time away from essential survival activities while potentially demanding expensive compensation payments that could impoverish families for generations. Many disputes were never brought before assemblies simply because the participants couldn't afford the potential consequences of formal legal action. The psychological impact of living under such an arbitrary and harsh legal system was severe, creating constant anxiety about potential accusations and the need to maintain perfect social standing within the community. The knowledge that a single mistake or false accusation could result in death, slavery, or exile shaped every social interaction and decision. Yet, despite its brutality and apparent randomness, this legal system did provide some stability and order to Viking communities that might otherwise have descended into complete chaos. The threat of legal consequences deterred some antisocial behavior, while the compensation system provided alternatives to endless cycles of violence that could destroy entire settlements. The gradual evolution of Viking legal traditions over time shows how these societies were slowly developing more sophisticated approaches to justice and conflict resolution. Though the pace of change was glacially slow by modern standards, and the fundamental harshness of the system remained constant throughout the Viking Age. Now imagine trying to maintain your sanity and sense of justice while navigating this legal nightmare every single day, knowing that any neighbor could accuse you of crimes you didn't commit, and that your fate would be determined by red-hot iron, boiling water, or the whims of men whose primary qualification for rendering judgment was their ability to survive in a world that seemed designed to kill everyone in it as efficiently as possible. The religious beliefs that permeated every aspect of this harsh legal system were equally alien and disturbing to modern sensibilities, creating a spiritual landscape where divine favor had to be constantly earned through sacrifice, violence, and strict adherence to customs that made daily survival even more complicated and dangerous than it already was. The Norse pantheon wasn't populated by benevolent deities who loved humanity unconditionally. These were volatile, selfish beings who demanded constant tribute and were just as likely to punish their followers as reward them. Odin, the chief god, was known for his treachery and willingness to break oaths when it served his purposes. He gained his wisdom by hanging himself from a tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, an act of self-torture that Vikings saw as admirable rather than insane. Thor, despite his reputation as a protector of humanity, was primarily concerned with his own glory, and was quick to anger when not properly honored. The stories describe him as willing to destroy entire communities if they failed to show adequate respect or provide sufficient sacrifices. His hammer wasn't just a weapon against giants and monsters, but a tool for enforcing divine will against humans who stepped out of line. Freya, the goddess associated with love and fertility, demanded blood sacrifices and sexual rituals that would horrify modern religious practitioners. Her worship included ceremonies where participants engaged in activities that were considered sacred, but would be classified as criminal assault in any civilized legal system. The line between religious devotion and sexual violence was virtually non-existent in many Norse rituals. The concept of fate, controlled by the 3 Norns who wove the threads of destiny, created a worldview where personal responsibility was minimized, while divine predestination justified almost any action. If your fate was already determined, then moral choices became irrelevant, and resistance to divine will was both futile and blasphemous. This fatalistic philosophy encouraged passivity in the face of suffering, while providing convenient excuses for inflicting harm on others. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors went after death in battle, wasn't the peaceful paradise that modern people might imagine. It was described as a place of endless fighting, where the dead spent eternity killing each other repeatedly, their wounds healing each night so they could fight again the next day. This eternal violence was considered the highest reward available to human souls. The religious calendar was built around seasonal festivals that required enormous sacrifices of valuable resources that communities could barely afford to lose. The Yule celebration that marked winter solstice involved slaughtering the best livestock and consuming precious stored foods in massive feasts that demonstrated devotion to the gods, while potentially condemning families to starvation before spring arrived. Human sacrifice was a regular feature of major religious observances, with slaves and prisoners providing the blood offerings that gods demanded for their continued favor. These weren't quick, merciful deaths, but prolonged rituals of torture that were believed to increase the spiritual power of the sacrifice. The more suffering involved, the greater the divine benefit received by the community. The methods of human sacrifice were deliberately cruel and varied according to which god was being honored. Sacrifices to Odin involved hanging, often preceded by torture and mutilation. Thor preferred victims who were beaten to death with hammers or clubs. Freya's sacrifices included sexual assault and dismemberment that combined religious devotion with sadistic entertainment for the assembled worshippers. Children weren't exempt from these religious obligations, and evidence suggests that young victims were sometimes preferred because their innocence was believed to make their deaths more pleasing to the gods. Families might be required to surrender their own children for sacrifice during particularly important ceremonies or times of crisis when divine intervention was desperately needed. The ritual consumption of sacrificial blood was considered essential for maintaining spiritual connection with the gods. Participants would drink the blood of sacrificed animals and humans while it was still warm, believing that this practice transferred some of the victim's life force to the consumer. Refusing to participate in these blood rituals could result in accusations of impiety that carried severe social and legal consequences. Divination practices involved examining the entrails of sacrificed animals to determine divine will and predict future events. The priests who performed these examinations wielded enormous influence because their interpretations could determine whether communities went to war, moved to new locations, or made other crucial decisions that affected everyone's survival. The treatment of religious sites and objects reflected beliefs about divine presence that made every aspect of worship potentially dangerous. Sacred groves couldn't be entered without proper rituals and offerings. Holy springs required specific ceremonies before their waters could be used. Even touching religious artifacts inappropriately could bring divine punishment that might affect entire families or communities. Seasonal rituals often involved community-wide ordeals that tested everyone's faith and endurance while reinforcing social hierarchies and religious orthodoxy. Winter ceremonies might require participants to endure extreme cold and hunger while demonstrating their devotion through painful acts of self-mortification and public confession of sins. The role of women in religious ceremonies was complex and often involved activities that were both empowering and degrading. Female priests, called vulvas, could achieve significant status and influence through their mastery of satyr magic, but their training involved ordeals and rituals that would be considered abuse by modern standards. The practice of satyr itself was viewed with suspicion and fear, even by those who relied on its practitioners for healing and divination. The magic was believed to involve sexual congress with spirits and gods, making female practitioners both powerful and morally suspect in the eyes of their communities. Male practitioners of satyr faced even greater social stigma because the magic was considered inherently feminine, and its practice by men was seen as a form of sexual deviance that threatened their status and honor. Yet the power attributed to satyr magic was so great that some men risked social ostracism to master these dangerous techniques. The integration of magical practices into daily life meant that ordinary activities like cooking, farming, and crafting were surrounded by rituals and superstitions that had to be carefully observed to avoid spiritual contamination or divine displeasure. Simple mistakes in religious protocol could have catastrophic consequences for individuals and their families. So, there you have it. A single day in the life of a medieval Viking, where survival wasn't guaranteed and comfort was a luxury no one could afford. From the moment you woke up on that scratchy seaweed mattress to the endless cycle of violence, hunger, and supernatural dread that defined every waking hour, the Viking world was a relentless test of human endurance that most of us simply couldn't pass. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm, safe bed, perhaps you'll appreciate just how far we've come from those brutal days when staying alive required carrying weapons, drinking ale for breakfast, and accepting that death could come from something as simple as a bad tooth or an angry neighbor. Sweet dreams.